I would like to reiterate that the Roger Revelle Lecture series was established by this Commission IOC back in 1991 to recognize outstanding contributions to climate-related ocean sciences by inspired researchers who communicate their knowledge and global vision of the challenges facing our planet in order to shape a better future for humankind. The lecture is dedicated to Roger Revelle, 1909-1991, who was among the early scientists to study anthropogenic global warming, and he was also one of the founding fathers of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. Professor Dr. Hans-Otto Pörtner was invited to give the IOC Roger Revelle Memorial Lecture 2022 in recognition of his leadership in climate science and climate negotiations for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, SROC. And, of course, for his key role in making climate change recognized as ocean change. The IOC has for long been, and continues to be, deeply involved in climate research as well as the interface between climate science and policy. With a Roger Revelle Memorial Lecture by a leading scientist as Professor Dr. Hans-Otto Pörtner, the IOC wishes to emphasize this further and to draw the attention of the broadest possible audience to the challenges posed to the ocean and humanity. The 2022 lecture is focused on the topic Climate Change is Ocean Change. Without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Dr. Hans-Otto Pörtner. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the honor of your invitation to follow such a long-standing tradition in giving you the Roger Revelle Memorial Lecture. That is an honor indeed, and it reflects also at the same time that the ocean has played a key role in this assessment cycle. We have covered ocean issues in virtually all of the reports that have been produced, and I've just highlighted four of them where I was involved, and that is the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, the special report on climate change and land that looked at ocean and land interactions, and then the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And just in the end of February, we released the Working Group 2 report, which also included ocean chapters and also included the ocean in the summary for policymakers. And there is a little suffix to this title. I'm a physiologist, so you will have to deal with some physiological information during this lecture as well. And what I'm also referring to with respect to inclusion of the ocean is the first ever official collaboration between the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's not called panel, it's called platform. They want it to be a little different, but in essence, their way of organization is similar to ours. And we released that workshop report mid of last year. Now, I think in the Working Group 2 report, we were developing an especially synthetic view of where the issues stand with respect to the ocean and to the globe. We are looking at the current situation as one that is where the planet is in imbalance, and imbalance being caused by human activities causing climate change, and climate change feeding back on human society itself, as well as on ecosystems and biodiversity, damaging both sides. And human society also, during especially the industrial area, impacts ecosystems and biodiversity, and these challenges now connect and add to those of climate change. There are risks resulting, and these risks include and consider the exposure of natural and human systems to hazards coming out of the climate issues like warming and other challenges, storms, heat waves, and then the vulnerability of the system in question and its exposure to that hazard. And such risk assessment is kind of a synthetic analysis done when considering the impacts of climate change. But this figure also indicates that there are positive interactions between these systems which counteract the current challenges, and that is human society can adapt to and mitigate climate change. Certainly there is a risk of maladaptation as well. Ecosystems also feed back and adapt to and contribute to mitigation, something that is in the current debate as well, to what extent they can help us control the climate system. And human society can decide to conserve and restore ecosystems because one thing is very clear. Humans are dependent on both, on a stabilized climate and on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity because there are livelihoods supported and ecosystem services provided. How does this take us into a future? And this is something that is more and more in these IPCC reports. We not only look at the problem, but we also look at how to solve it. So we certainly living in a time where action is urgent, and we need enablers, and these include proper governance, finance, knowledge, and capacity, and catalyzing conditions, and last not least, technologies. We would see the planet moving towards a sustainable future where the positive interactions between those systems that I've already highlighted are being strengthened, and where we are looking at this synthetically under a concept we call climate resilient development. This includes aspects of human health, it includes ecosystem health, and includes planetary health. In a way, it's an organismic consideration of the different levels of organization and its components that need to be brought back into stable and steady state functioning. This involves various systems on the human side, on the ecosystem side, and that is where the future should be, and that has been elaborated and synthetically developed, especially in our summary for policymakers. So what kind of role does the ocean play in this picture? Currently, the ocean is transitioning to unprecedented conditions, and we've highlighted that already in the special report on ocean and cryosphere, and the Working Group 1 report has emphasized this again and has sort of brought forward results which are very, very similar to these. That is why I've used these figures for the sake, because I think they are more clear than the ones coming out of the Working Group 1 report. So we have for this back and forth. We have different scenarios that have been compared. First of all, an unabated emissions scenario, which is certainly no longer representing what is currently there, because there are ambitious emissions reductions happening here and there, not ambitious enough. But this is still a high-end scenario that is within the range of possibilities. And then we have a high ambition emissions reduction scenario, which sort of reflects that changes are developing more slowly and taking less of an effect as well. So we have ocean heat content increasing, and that is a crucial role for the ocean. More than 90% of the heat taken up by the planet goes into the ocean. And we have, as a consequence, an increase in global mean sea surface temperature. We have an increase in marine heat wave days, so we talk about heat waves not only on land, but also for the ocean. We have, on average, a loss in ocean oxygen, and we have an increase in CO2 levels in the ocean, causing ocean acidification, a research direction that actually started based on earlier discussions concerning a special report of the IPCC on carbon capture and storage. So we have changes in the ocean that have an implication for ocean biology. But these are the kind of average trends. These are building on variability in the ocean. And this is shown here. We have certainly different temperature areas across the ocean, but also we have a temperature range that is developing within each of those areas. So there's not only a net change, but this change is building on inherent variability of the system. This is also true for ocean acidification, where we have different acidification anyway as a natural background, especially in those areas where we also have oxygen deficiency developing in the midwater layers of the ocean. And in these so-called upwelling areas, and we see those here as bluish patches, we have already waters of low pH, and anthropogenic acidification is adding to those patterns. And then we have oxygen deficiencies being strengthened. This concerns the midwater layers in the tropics, in the low latitudes, and you see here how over time these oxygen poor midwater layers are expanding, and they are the high oxygen layers at the top are shallowing, and the intensity of oxygen deficiency in the center of those layers is aggravating. So these are the core three drivers. We call them the deadly trio in the ocean, because where they come together, they have the largest effect. And there are some hypotheses and evidence that these were also the drivers that in Earth history were contributing to the mass extinction events during these evolutionary crises. And certainly there is variability also for light, nutrients, and food availability. And if we look at oxygen, that has been in the focus more recently, although this has never been really forgotten along the way. This once again highlights the hypoxic areas here on the western sides of the continents and around the Indian subcontinent or in the North Pacific. And you see how these places are placed, and that these are areas where actually oxygen deficiency can be developing so severe that their higher life is constrained. And this is also true for coastal areas where we have oxygen deficiencies, as reflected here by these reddish areas, where anthropogenic activities like nutrient input also causes deficiencies, and together with warming, oxygen deficiency can develop so strongly that no higher life is possible anymore. Does this already reflect what at large scales is happening in the ocean? What do we see there in terms of impact? Well, the largest and certainly overarching trend currently is that we see organisms in the ocean shifting in terms of their biogeography. And this is now taken here into projections, and you see that biodiversity, species richness, is declining in the lower latitudes as well as in some other areas. So we have a belt developing here where higher life is moving out of those lowest latitudes. Depending on the degree of warming, this trend will be exacerbating. And we are already, and this is reflecting the current situation, we are already seeing a biodiversity valley developing in the tropics. So this is already and has already started, and certainly one would like to see that this stops somehow, or maybe even reverted. So the current drivers of change at large scales are warming and warming velocities causing shifts in biogeography. This means, and this is differential between species, there's a change in species interactions. Species have new encounters and need to find new ways of collecting food. So all of this is turning the ecosystems over with an as yet unclear result how and where this might end. So community composition is changing, and on top of this we now have the concern about whether there's a role for ocean oxygen in these effects, and also a role for CO2 or ocean acidification. And this is again the finding, the recent findings or the recent report of the changes in the low latitudes, where we have these trends here developing between the 50s and the 70s. We already had such a, sorry, this is the baseline here. This is 50s to 70s. The blue line is the 70s to the 90s. And we see that this is exacerbating more recently into these biodiversity increases in when the biodiversity moves out, is now also being compensated for and decreasing again. So it's a dynamic environment, and we also see the biodiversity pattern across latitudes in how it unfolds, and there it needs to be one statement being made. We don't really fully understand why and how that is. What is lacking is a deeper understanding of the temperature-dependent marine biodiversity across latitudes. We know certainly that the tropical oceans reach the upper thermal limits of these organisms, but why we have this latitudinal decline of biodiversity from the lower latitudes to the higher latitudes, and how it can be explained in a mechanism-based understanding is currently not fully clear. So there's research to be done on this area. In a way, it's a basic research that is needed to develop this understanding, because future changes will certainly affect these patterns. This resembles a little bit of what happened during the mass extinction events in Earth's history, and we had, and this is a sort of simplistic picture of the Permian-Triassic world, where we had a tropical, humid world, and we had clear latitudinal gradients in the ocean, but also on land. And loss of tropical habitat was a typical pattern during those times and affected also species on land. And what we can say and postulate is that terrestrial biological changes were driven by heat, whereas ocean biological changes were certainly and are currently already driven by heat, but there may also be a role for hypoxia, anoxia, and ocean acidification. How does it match, and how can we actually build this on our knowledge of how different life forms are placed with respect to their temperature tolerance? And this here goes across from the archaea to the eukarya, from the simplest bacteria to plants and animals. And you see, if you go up in the hierarchy of life, how upper thermal tolerance comes down. So metazoans and the higher plants are the most complex and at the same time the most heat vulnerable organisms on the planet. This is something to keep in mind when interpreting those data, and we are metazoans ourselves. So when we are changing the planet, we are also exposing us to these physiological challenges. And this is sort of the evolutionary background. While we are talking about genetic modifications of crops and so forth, we have to keep in mind that these are evolutionary brick walls. These upper limits cannot be modified. They are tied to the way of how these organisms are organized at their highest complexity level. And with a simple complexity indicator, you can see this relationship between thermal tolerance for the organism, reflected here as maximum temperature for growth, and its level of complexity with respect to the number of compartments that are coordinated within the organism. The mechanism background of that also needs further study, also with respect to how these organisms are actually placed and can be compared with respect to that. So there is sort of, from this overarching question, there are research questions that are still not yet addressed. So what we can say is higher complex organisms will become extinct in the warmest ocean area, and we may also already see the beginning of this, them moving out. But they may not become extinct as a species, but they're being extirpated. That is the term used. They're being removed from those warmest places and have to go, but they still have a place to go and keep to their traditional temperature area. And such projections relate to observed distribution patterns also during warming periods in Earth's history and in the present period. But these polar areas play an special role in this context. When we talk about the Arctic and the Antarctic and look at them, how they relate during different degrees of global warming, then we see especially strong warming trends here in the Arctic and then in the Antarctic, and both of them are developing these trends more strongly, even with degrees of global warming. And here the organisms have nowhere to go. They have especially narrow temperature windows. They cannot move to even higher latitudes. The risk of extinction, as emphasized in a recent study, is highest in the higher latitudes compared to organisms in the lower latitudes, because the biogeographical shift is no longer possible. And let's just take the Antarctic here, the Antarctic organisms as an example, where we have different ecosystems. We have ecosystems that are highly reliant on rigid structures, calcified structures, and where we currently already see an expansion of crabs, which as crushing predators might actually destroy such ecosystems that were typical once in Earth's history at a time in the Mesozoic, more broadly on the planet. And these are now challenged. Then this relates to the recent discovery of a huge area of breeding colonies of ice fish in the Antarctic, and you see those nests here with the individuals. These ice fish have no hemoglobin in their blood. They're especially thermally vulnerable and may actually, with continued warming, then also experience severe loss of habitat and existence. And then the retreating variable sea ice affects a key organism in the Antarctic food chain, that is the Antarctic krill. So we have this large picture, we're seeing trends, we're building hypotheses, but we also would like to have a unifying picture of cause and effect. And understanding that, and there is still a discussion about this. What is warming? What is hypoxia? What is ocean acidification? And the hypothesis here is certainly when there is hypoxia, this is the overarching effect, and that is stronger, surpassing those of future ocean warming and acidification. And there is also evidence, increasing evidence, that what has happened in Earth's history to the marine clades and their sensitivities is conforming with what has happened during the evolutionary crisis in Earth's history. So the mechanisms are the same, and when we look at the current situation, we can understand it as a model, sorry to say, as a model for what has happened during evolutionary history on the planet. Already a conclusion is that the synergistic interaction between warming and hypoxia has the greatest potency as a proximate driver of extinction, pointing already to where these drivers combine, that they may have the strongest effect. And the next step is an integrative analysis. How do we bring this together for understanding paleo and present vulnerabilities more comprehensively? If we once again look at oxygen and hypoxia, what does it do? Well, there are different tolerances in animal groups with the respect to hypoxia, the larger groups are indicated here, and the smaller groups here. And what we clearly see is when oxygen falls below a critical level of 60 micromoles per liter, we have a transition to smaller individuals in those areas. And this is a general tendency also, and you see that emphasized here, that there is a dependence on body size on with respect to vulnerability to hypoxia. And again, here this is a projection, but this is the global average. And if you see there's only a few % change, it does not reflect that there are places where these changes are especially large, like in the midwater areas and the coastal areas currently. Now we have a concept that is emerging and that may be encompassing these patterns. As a common functional background for all organisms, they are specializing on limited ranges of ambient temperature. And within those ranges, they show their temperature-dependent performance with an optimum as their optimum temperature and performance is declining towards the low end and towards the high end. And these windows are dynamic. These are performance curves which are dynamic because they can also respond to other drivers like CO2 and hypoxia. And what has been a hypothesis in the AR5 is now increasingly supported by the respective evidence. These performance curves are also a decisive element. You find them in bacteria, you find them in plants, you find them in animals. And they also define, because they specialize on temperatures, how species interact and where they can interact. Where these performance curves overlap, these are the coexistence ranges for the species. And when these performance curves change in relation to each other, this is defining how species interact. In simplified terms, it is defining who is stronger and who is whom. So in that respect, and that relates to the biogeography of a species where the upper temperature tolerance is limiting its existence towards the tropics, and the lower tolerance the existence towards the poles, and this reflects the shift in biogeography. And again, CO2 and hypoxia may modify this and define what's happening, and the polar stenotherms here are indicated as well because they are especially vulnerable. And for animals, we can now explain those thermal performance curves based on principles of oxygen supply and temperature-dependent capacity limitation, and that's how hypoxia and temperature come together. This is the basis for their interaction. We have an aerobic window which has characteristic limits. There is oxygen deficiency developing in body fluids as you take the organism towards thermal extremes, and then you see oxygen deficiency causing an onset of anaerobiosis and before cell damage happens, and within that window you see the temperature-dependent performance curve. And you have a range of active tolerance here, and this is time-dependent passive tolerance as the organism is exposed to extremes. This also concerns the life stages of the species. And only very recently we were able to publish a meta-analysis of how life stages of fish evolve, develop during their ontogeny with respect to their temperature tolerance. And that is relevant for their climate sensitivity. So we see here the embryos and the eggs have the narrowest temperature windows, and the adult spawners that are full of eggs or sperm have similarly narrow windows. Whereas in the center, the larvae and adults have wider thermal ranges. We can explain these with respect to their temperature-dependent energy turnover. This may be going a little bit too far for you now, and the temperature response of these patterns. But this meta-analysis found that this principle is in operation in 700 species of marine and freshwater fish looked at. So whether a species is vulnerable is not just defined by the adults or the fish that are being collected through fisheries activities, but it is really key and most severe for the youngest life stages of those species. So many of the data in the literature will need to be reinterpreted. There's also some modeling activity, how we can actually connect this to the physical changes in the environment, knowing the physiology of the species, and this is the Atlantic cod shown here. And what you see here is a modeling of its performance, of its in a way, it's a modeling of its metabolic habitat where it can remain active. And what you see here, the blue dots indicate where the species is. It's a shelf species on both sides of the Atlantic. And what you see here with respect to this black line is sort of its upper or its limiting metabolic activity, also delineating its southern distribution limit. So this was the first evidence we had to say we can really understand what is limiting the biogeography of a species in the field based on physiological mechanisms. And you can generalize a bit this and see how temperature and oxygen come together more broadly across the ocean, and the reddish color here indicates where the temperature-oxygen combination is especially severe and how it will be more severe in such a high emission scenario. We see a global mean decrease by 20% in metabolic activities allowed to these fish, and that goes across fish species, and in the northern higher latitudes of the Pacific, it's more a 40% constraint. So fishing activities in the ocean will be severely hampered by climate change if we allow climate change to go on unabated. And we have modeled this for fishing results. And this is the fisheries catch potential in various areas is quantified, and the baseline situation is reflected here. Fisheries catch potential present in virtually all areas. And in a 1.5 degree world, we already see shifts. There's a decline in fisheries results to be expected in the lower latitudes, as indicated, and there are some high latitudes, especially in the Arctic, that may benefit, and we already see these trends, Atlantic cod moving into the higher latitude places. And this will become even more severe with 4 degrees warming on average. And the resolution for those data in terms of reflecting the ocean changes along the time while the physiological knowledge was emerging, there was also an improvement in the results of the ocean modeling. And this is a compilation how the resolution was during the AR4 2007, how it improved already with respect to the AR5 in 2014. And then in the AR6, these resolutions were sort of influencing the results presented by the Working Group 1 report. And now at AVI, the most recent improvement in the resolution is really impressive in terms of providing us very detailed understanding, also allowing us now to take the modeling into the coastal areas where the resolution was relatively poor up to now. We've been using these improved modeling efforts by our physical oceanographer colleagues and modelers and climate modelers, and applying this, looking at the interactions between temperature and ocean acidification. And you see this here for the early life stages for the eggs of Atlantic cod compared to cola cod. Atlantic cod moving into the Arctic and really putting pressure on polar cod, that is a species endemic in the Arctic. And you see, first of all, there are different temperature windows for those life stages, and you see how actually, as projected, as predicted or hypothesized, how the temperature window is shrinking under the influence of elevated CO2. We have modeled the spawning habitat of those fish, how it presents itself currently in the different areas where Atlantic cod is present, and also for the polar cod. And then we can look into what is happening under global warming. And we have actually picked the most vulnerable time window in the life history of those species. And you see how the spawning habitat, the suitable spawning habitat along the Norwegian coast is moving north. So the species are losing with continued global warming. The southern more spawning areas, the southern stocks are suffering as a consequence, and they are moving up north. And the same is true for polar cod. There is a constraint on the spawning of polar cod, but this was high up already. It's being really compressed by the degrees of global warming in the Arctic. Now, with this sort of specific, deeper insight into the ocean biology in relation to the physical changes, this is certainly not the full picture that the ocean has for us. A summary can be due to the current trajectory of human-derived greenhouse gas emissions, the atmosphere and ocean will continue to warm, the ocean will continue to acidify and lose oxygen, and atmospheric and ocean circulation patterns will be altered. Think of the just recent debate of coming back of how the Gulf Stream will be affected. The cryosphere will continue to lose ice in all forms, and sea level will rise. Let's go to the sea level side, and we already had some of this summarized in our special report on ocean and cryosphere. Here are the different components contributing to sea level rise. That's the Greenland ice sheet, again 2 scenarios contributing in terms of meters until the end of this century. There's the Antarctic ice sheet contributing, and there is the glacier loss from the mountain areas, which is contributing. And there is ocean heat content increasing, causing an expansion of the ocean body, also contributing to sea level rise. So thermal expansion, glacier melt, and ice sheet melt come together. And the projections are this. Depending on the degree of global warming, we are either able, and this is until 2300, to keep sea level rise below 1 meter, or with further warming, we go beyond, and in the high-end scenario, we have something between 2.5 and 7 meters of sea level rise, and you can imagine what kind of challenge this will be, especially for the low-lying coastlines and the small island states. This compares nicely to the last interglacial, where temperatures have been similar to our current situation, which is giving us the impression that some of these sea level rise is already bought in, and that is really urgent to stop global warming in order to keep it and be able to keep it under control, because losing coastlines means losing human habitat. And the Antarctic has a lot of sea level rise available to us. There are 7 meters coming from Greenland, possibly, and 54, 56 meters coming from the Antarctic if we really trigger the whole system by global warming. But more realistically, a contribution with unabated emissions could be 13 meters by 2300. This is within the range of uncertainty, because there's one process that we don't really have under full control in our understanding and with respect to global warming, and that is the so-called ice cliff instability, where if the ice cliff goes, the glacier flow is increased and the melting process is accelerated. And this would be the most significant global influence of Antarctic changes with respect to global mean sea level rise and its influence on society and nature in all coastal regions. That should accelerate our thinking about bringing global warming under control. And the mean increase in sea level is not the only part of the story. Also the storm surges and the extreme events add on top of this. And the frequency of those, and this was a recent past, there may have been an event that we call a historical centennial event. It happened once per century. Now these things are accelerated by mean sea level rise and may actually happen up to once per year. So coastal damages and losses will certainly increase as well. And if we look at the patterns that we are already seeing in the ocean, then we can say, based on the darkness of these dots and looking again at a high emissions reduction scenario compared to an unabated emissions scenario, how even here in this scenario we are already seeing storm surges that are higher than previously normally experienced in many, especially lower latitude places. So sea level rise is upon us, and coastal changes and challenges are upon us as well, calling for adaptation, coastal adaptation, to balance those changes. How do we deal with those issues? We are doing risk assessment. That is what I already said. We are looking at the hazards, at the vulnerability of the affected system and its exposure. And then we say, okay, we qualify the risk according to the changes happening to that vulnerable system and to what extent we find it tolerable or not. So there is judgment involved. There are challenges to adaptation. Risk reduction by adaptation has its limit. And these limits are hard, and I indicated that already for natural systems. We can't really modify natural systems too much in order to make them resilient under climate change. But there are also limits to the capacity of human society to adapt. And these limits to adaptation here could be physical, ecological, technological, economic, political, institutional, psychological, and or socio-cultural. So many different facets to be considered when considering adaptation limits. We are using one common language sort of for qualifying the risk levels, and this is the graphic tool, the so-called burning ember diagrams, where risk goes from undetectable white to moderate yellow to high red and very high purple. And the very high, the purple has a very high probability of severe impacts and the presence of significant irreversibility or persistence of climate-related hazards combined with persistence of climate-related hazards combined with limited ability to adapt. So it's a possibility using this risk language to compare risks in different sectors and systems and come up with a unifying picture of what we should be going for. And that links to the current debate in the Climate Convention of how we define the common goal or global goal for adaptation. And this is a risk assessment from our recent report, where we look at systems across. It concerns food production from crops, fisheries, and livestock in Africa, concerns biodiversity, but also concerns human society, mortality or morbidity from heat and infectious disease. Looking more specifically at the Mediterranean with respect to water quality and availability, health and well-being, but also including a continent which we may think about as being less vulnerable than the others, Europe, where we see water scarcity to people in southeastern Europe, and we again see heat stress and mortality and morbidity. And in both, we have also consideration of coastal flooding. And we look at the risk, how it develops with global warming, with increased global warming. And what is interesting for all of these sectors, they are, if we look at the risk transition from moderate to high, they are strongly supporting the Paris Agreement and the ambitious side of the temperature limit discussed in the Paris Agreement. So 1.5 global warming is reflecting the risk transition from moderate to high, and 2 takes us for all of those already in the high risk area. There are more examples, but what we can already say from these, that avoiding high risk would be possible by keeping global warming below 1.5 for most systems. We can say that for these examples, but let's look at others. Here we have the ecosystems on land and in the ocean. And for terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, actually 1.5 is again rather close to the transition from moderate to high risk. Ocean systems here, warm water corals, they are already on the downslide. We will be losing large extents and areas of them. 70 to 90% of those will be gone under 1.5 degrees global warming. But for other systems, it looks better. But it's still a warning, and it's still certainly better to keep global warming to 1.5 than 2 degrees. And if we look at the polar areas and look at the sea ice ecosystems, look at the marine mammals, look at the seabirds, and again compare 1.5 and 2, then we see that even in the Arctic, even in the Antarctic, the 1.5 and 2 comparison makes sense. The Arctic certainly is the more vulnerable because open system. The Antarctic, being isolated by the circumantarctic current, is a little bit less resilient, but there are groups like seabirds that are highly vulnerable in that place to global warming already. So 1.5 comes out of this risk assessment as the preferred temperature goal. We are talking about the International Decade on Ocean Research. Do we have time to do research for a decade and waiting with respect to action on climate? No, certainly not. So whatever we do in terms of research must be done in addition to ambitious climate action. So research needs persist while we take urgent climate action trying to move the planet towards sustainability. Topics for ocean action combined with research would be, for example, setting up a network for marine conservation, as is currently discussed for many areas, stabilizing the role of the ocean in climate change mitigation, because as global warming proceeds, it is losing that role progressively. Considering the adaptation limits of marine organisms and ecosystems, and maintaining a future for marine biodiversity certainly calls for ambitious action at the same time as developing this baseline understanding, improving our baseline understanding of what defines the background of biodiversity in the ocean. We need long-term observatories, atmospheric, cryospheric, oceanographic, and also with respect to biology, complemented by experimental studies in order to develop an understanding, a better understanding of the mechanisms and of cause and effect. And we need modeling approaches as indicated. They need to be coordinated, international and transdisciplinary research efforts by all disciplines and training programs, and this is emphasizing the respective activities for the Antarctic. And we need certainly adequate resourcing for the respective scientific workforce. Some facilities are improving. Happy to tell you that Polarstern 2 has now been approved by the German government and will soon be under construction. We can further improve the modeling activities. Here you see an effort again from the AVI in terms of improved ocean modeling, not only representing sort of the larger scale changes, but even representing the eddies in the ocean and bringing the models closer to what we actually observe. Resolving those in climate simulations, in resolving important local dynamics makes sense in order to develop a more comprehensive picture, and also makes sense in order to combine ocean dynamics with sea ice dynamics, and at the same time certainly the energy, ever-increasing energy and computing demands need to be kept under control. But there are also policy recommendations coming out of the recent reports. Clearly, changes in the ocean are rapid, changes in the cryosphere are rapid, and we need similarly rapid environmental governance responses and maybe changes, improvements in structure, including potential changes to agreements that have previously taken many years to achieve. So we need transformation in all systems in order to be able to stand up against climate change. Governance for managing climate impacts, especially in the ocean and cryosphere environments, is considered poorly developed despite its importance for decision making, and that reflects, I think, ongoing current debates. We need to communicate the urgency of drastic emissions reductions to ensure that ocean environments and the cryosphere are preserved. We need to meet the growing management difficulties, logistic challenges, and research requirements elicited by changes to the ocean and its ecosystems. And we need to continue support for research delivering evidence-informed options for the reductions of uncertainties in our understanding and for climate change mitigation and adaptation actions. A summarizing statement for our report is as follows. The science is clear, and that concerns ocean, land, and human society. Any further delay in concerted global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future for all. This report, as well as the others, offers solutions to the world, and it is over to you now. Thank you very much for your attention.